In the mountains of Afghanistan, where death whispers through every valley and courage is measured in heartbeats, Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez pressed her eye against the scope of her rifle. Below her, 163 American Rangers were trapped in a kill zone, surrounded by hundreds of Taliban fighters who had been planning this ambush for months. The enemy had chosen their moment perfectly. Dawn was breaking, ammunition was running low, and rescue seemed impossible. What happened next would become legendary in military circles, a story that would be whispered in barracks around the world. A single woman, armed with nothing but her rifle and an unbreakable will, was about to prove that sometimes one person can change the course of history. This is not a Hollywood fantasy or a video game scenario. This is the true account of how Maria Rodriguez, a 28-year-old sniper from Texas, turned an impossible situation into one of the most remarkable rescue operations in modern military history. The Taliban thought they had planned the perfect trap. They were wrong. They had never encountered someone like Maria Rodriguez. The morning air was crisp in the Khyber province of Afghanistan as Captain James Morrison led his patrol of 163 Rangers through what appeared to be a routine reconnaissance mission. The intel suggested light enemy presence in the area, making it seem like a standard operation. Morrison had been in Afghanistan for 8 months, and his instincts had kept his men alive through dozens of missions. But today, something felt different. Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez watched from her overwatch position on a ridge approximately 800 meters from the patrol route. She had been providing sniper support for Ranger operations for the past 6 months, and her reputation for precision was already becoming legendary among the troops. Born in San Antonio, Texas, Maria had grown up hunting with her father in the hill country, developing skills that would later save countless lives in the mountains of Afghanistan. Through her scope, Maria observed the terrain below with the trained eye of a professional. The valley her team was moving through was textbook ambush territory, high ground on both sides, limited escape routes, and plenty of cover for enemy fighters. She had expressed concerns about this particular route during the mission briefing, but intelligence reports indicated minimal threat levels. What the intelligence reports had failed to detect was the elaborate planning that had been taking place for weeks. Taliban commander Abdul Rahman had been watching American patrol patterns, studying their routes, and preparing what he believed would be a devastating blow to coalition forces. Rahman was not a typical Taliban fighter. He had received training from experienced fighters who had battled the Soviets decades earlier, and he understood the value of patience and careful preparation. For 3 weeks, Rahman and his fighters had been moving weapons and ammunition into carefully concealed positions throughout the valley. They had dug firing positions into the rocky terrain, created spider holes for quick movement, and established multiple fallback positions. Most importantly, they had waited for the right opportunity, a patrol large enough to make their victory significant, but isolated enough to prevent immediate reinforcement. The Rangers moved in a tactical formation, with point men scanning for IEDs and ambush positions. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez maintained visual contact through her scope, occasionally communicating with the patrol leader through encrypted radio channels. The mission was proceeding according to plan when Maria noticed something that made her blood run cold. Through her powerful scope, she could see muzzle flashes reflecting sunlight from positions that should have been empty. There were fighters in the rocks, carefully concealed, but visible to her trained eye. Even more alarming, she could see the distinctive shapes of RPG launchers being positioned. This was not a small harassment action. This was a major ambush involving what appeared to be a significant number of enemy fighters. Maria immediately activated her radio, her voice calm but urgent as she contacted Captain Morrison. The initial warnings came just as the first shots rang out across the valley. The ambush had begun, and it was far more extensive than anyone had anticipated. From her elevated position, Maria could see muzzle flashes erupting from dozens of positions simultaneously. The Taliban had achieved complete surprise, and her fellow Rangers were caught in a carefully prepared kill zone. The sound of automatic weapons fire echoed through the mountains as the Rangers scrambled for cover. Return fire was immediate, but limited by the disadvantageous position. Morrison quickly realized they were facing a force much larger than anticipated, and his priority shifted from mission accomplishment to survival and extraction. Through her scope, Maria began identifying specific threats and engaging targets. Her first shot eliminated a machine gunner who had been laying down suppressive fire on the pinned Rangers. The distinctive crack of her rifle began to punctuate the chaotic symphony of the firefight. Each shot was carefully calculated, each target specifically chosen to provide maximum relief for her trapped comrades. But as the firefight continued, the true scope of the ambush became apparent. Enemy fighters seemed to be emerging from every conceivable hiding place. RPG rounds began impacting near the Rangers' positions, and Maria realized that her friends were not just pinned down, they were surrounded by a force that appeared to number in the hundreds. Captain Morrison's attempts to call for immediate reinforcement met with devastating news. The nearest available support was hours away, and close air support was unavailable due to other ongoing operations. Weather conditions prevented helicopter extraction, and the surrounding terrain made rapid ground reinforcement impossible. The Rangers were effectively isolated, outnumbered by a ratio of at least 3-1, and running low on ammunition. From her position, Maria could see the tactical situation with crystal clarity. The Taliban had positioned fighters in a complete circle around the trapped Rangers, with overlapping fields of fire that made movement in any direction potentially fatal. Escape routes had been blocked or covered by snipers. This was not a random attack. This was a carefully orchestrated operation designed to eliminate an entire Ranger unit. The radio chatter revealed the growing desperation of the situation. Ammunition reports were becoming critical, casualty reports were mounting, and the enemy showed no signs of retreating. If anything, they appeared to be maneuvering for a final assault that would overwhelm the Rangers' defensive positions. Maria realized that she was not just a sniper providing support. She had become the only factor standing between her fellow Rangers and complete disaster. Her position on the ridge gave her a commanding view of the battlefield, but it also made her the primary hope for the survival of 163 American soldiers trapped in an impossible situation. The weight of responsibility settled on her shoulders as she began to understand what she would need to accomplish. This would not be a typical sniper mission focused on eliminating high-value targets. This would require her to single-handedly disrupt an entire enemy force, break their coordinated attack, and create opportunities for her fellow Rangers to survive until help arrived. Through her scope, Maria began systematically identifying priority targets, machine gun positions, RPG teams, and command elements that were coordinating the attack. But she also realized that ammunition conservation would be critical. Every shot would need to count, every target would need to be chosen for maximum impact, and she would need to maintain this precision for an unknown period of time. The Taliban fighters, confident in their overwhelming numbers and superior position, had no idea that their carefully planned ambush was about to encounter a force they had not anticipated. Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez was preparing to demonstrate that sometimes one person with the right skills and unwavering determination can change the entire outcome of a battle. As the firefight intensified and the situation became increasingly desperate for the trapped Rangers, Maria took a deep breath, steadied her rifle, and prepared to begin what would become one of the most remarkable individual combat performances in modern military history. The rescue operation was about to begin, and it would depend entirely on the skill, courage, and determination of a single female sniper positioned on a ridge overlooking the battlefield. The Taliban's confidence was evident in their aggressive tactics as they pressed their attack against the trapped Rangers. Abdul Rahman had positioned his fighters in a textbook encirclement, with machine gun teams providing suppressive fire while RPG teams prepared to eliminate the Rangers' defensive positions one by one. What Rahman could not have anticipated was that his perfectly executed ambush was being observed by someone with the skills to disrupt his entire operation. Maria Rodriguez adjusted her scope and began what she would later describe as the most intense period of her military career. Her first priority was eliminating the heavy weapons teams that posed the greatest threat to the trapped Rangers. Through her scope, she identified a PKM machine gun position that was laying down devastating fire on Captain Morrison's men. The gunner was partially concealed behind a boulder, but Maria could see enough of his profile for a clean shot. The shot rang out across the valley, and the machine gun fell silent. Before the Taliban fighters could react or identify her position, Maria had already shifted her aim to another target. A second machine gunner, positioned approximately 200 meters from the first, was preparing to take over the suppressive fire mission. Maria's second shot eliminated that threat as well, creating a temporary gap in the enemy's coordinated fire pattern. But Maria's actions had not gone unnoticed. Taliban fighters began scanning the ridgeline, trying to identify the source of the precise shots that were disrupting their attack. Several fighters redirected their fire toward her general position, but the range and angle made accurate return fire extremely difficult. Maria used this to her advantage, shifting positions slightly after each shot to avoid detection while maintaining her commanding view of the battlefield. Captain Morrison recognized the change in the tactical situation immediately. The overwhelming suppressive fire that had pinned his Rangers was becoming sporadic and uncoordinated. He seized the opportunity to reorganize his men's defensive positions and coordinate more effective return fire. Through his radio, he contacted Maria to coordinate their efforts and share intelligence about enemy positions. Maria's third target was an RPG team that had been moving into position to assault the Rangers' main defensive position. Through her scope, she could see two fighters carrying the distinctive shape of an RPG launcher, moving through the rocks toward a position that would give them a clear shot at Morrison's men. Maria waited until both fighters were visible, then eliminated the gunner with a precise headshot. The loader, panicked by the sudden death of his partner, abandoned the weapon and fled to a different position. The psychological impact on the Taliban fighters was becoming apparent. What had begun as a confident assault was turning into a confusing battle against an enemy they could not locate or effectively engage. Maria's position on the ridge gave her complete visual dominance of the battlefield, while her elevation and distance made return fire nearly impossible for the Taliban fighters armed primarily with AK-47s and light machine guns. But Maria knew that her individual efforts, while effective, would not be sufficient to break the ambush completely. The Taliban still held overwhelming numerical superiority, and they were beginning to adapt to the new tactical situation. She watched through her scope as enemy fighters began using smoke grenades to conceal their movements and coordinating their advance through covered routes that would eventually overwhelm the Rangers' positions. Rahman, the Taliban commander, was experiencing his first taste of doubt. His carefully planned ambush was not proceeding as expected, and his fighters were reporting casualties from an unknown sniper. But Rahman was an experienced fighter, and he quickly began implementing countermeasures. He ordered his men to begin a coordinated assault on multiple fronts, reasoning that overwhelming pressure would force the Rangers to exhaust their ammunition regardless of sniper support. Maria observed the Taliban's tactical shift and recognized the increased threat to the trapped Rangers. The enemy was no longer relying solely on suppressive fire and position attacks. They were beginning to mass for direct assault. She could see groups of fighters moving through covered approaches, preparing to rush the Rangers' positions from multiple directions simultaneously. Her target priority shifted to disrupt these assault preparations. Maria identified a Taliban fighter who appeared to be directing one of the assault groups, distinguished by his position and the way other fighters responded to his signals. Her shot eliminated what was clearly a squad leader, causing immediate confusion among his followers who scattered without continuing their advance. But the Taliban adapted quickly to each of Maria's interventions. Smoke grenades began creating concealment for their movements, and they started using human wave tactics that made individual marksmanship less effective. Maria realized that she needed to be more strategic in her target selection, focusing on eliminating key leaders and heavy weapons that could not be easily replaced rather than individual riflemen. The ammunition situation was becoming critical for both sides. The Rangers had been engaged for over an hour, and their ammunition supplies were approaching dangerous levels. Maria herself was managing her ammunition carefully, aware that resupply was impossible and that she needed to maintain her effectiveness for an unknown duration. Through her scope, Maria noticed that the Taliban fighters were also showing signs of ammunition management. The constant suppressive fire that had characterized the early stages of the ambush was becoming more sporadic and targeted. This gave her an opportunity to observe their resupply patterns and identify ammunition storage points that could be targeted to further disrupt their operations. Captain Morrison's radio calls revealed the increasingly desperate nature of the Ranger situation. Several of his men had been wounded, medical supplies were running low, and the defensive perimeter was under constant pressure. The promised reinforcements remained hours away, and the The tactical situation continued to favor the Taliban despite Maria's individual effectiveness. But Maria's efforts were having a cumulative effect that extended beyond the immediate casualties she was inflicting. The Taliban fighters were becoming increasingly cautious, spending more time seeking cover and less time maintaining offensive pressure. Their coordinated attacks were becoming fragmented as individual fighters hesitated to expose themselves to the unknown sniper who had already demonstrated lethal precision. Rahman realized that his overwhelming numerical advantage was being negated by a single enemy sniper who had somehow achieved a position of tactical dominance over the entire battlefield. His frustration grew as reports came in of key personnel being eliminated and assault teams being disrupted just as they prepared to advance. The Taliban commander made a critical decision that would fundamentally change the nature of the battle. Rather than continuing to accept casualties from an enemy he could not effectively engage, Rahman decided to divide his forces. Part of his fighters would continue to pin down the Rangers, while another group would attempt to locate and eliminate the sniper who was disrupting his entire operation. Maria observed this tactical shift through her scope and recognized both the opportunity and the increased danger it represented. The Taliban's decision to split their forces would reduce the pressure on the trapped Rangers, potentially giving them breathing room to reorganize and extend their defensive capabilities. But it would also bring enemy fighters directly toward her position, turning her from a hidden observer into a primary target. As Taliban fighters began moving up the ridgeline toward her position, Maria faced a critical decision. She could attempt to relocate to maintain her concealment, but that would temporarily reduce her ability to provide support for the trapped Rangers. Alternatively, she could maintain her position and attempt to engage the approaching fighters, but that would eventually lead to her position being overrun by superior numbers. The radio chatter from the Rangers below revealed their awareness of the changing tactical situation. Captain Morrison recognized that the sniper support that had been crucial to their survival was about to be threatened, and he began coordinating his men's fire to provide what support they could from Maria's position. Maria made her choice. Rather than retreating, she would maintain her position and continue providing support for the trapped Rangers while simultaneously engaging the fighters approaching her location. This decision would require her to divide her attention between supporting the Rangers and defending herself, a tactical challenge that would test every aspect of her training and experience. Through her scope, she could see Taliban fighters beginning their ascent toward her position, moving through the rocky terrain with the confidence of hunters closing in on their prey. What they did not realize was that they were approaching someone who had trained for exactly this type of situation, someone who understood that sometimes the only way out of an impossible situation is to fight through it with absolute determination and unwavering skill. Maria Rodriguez found herself in a situation that no amount of training could have fully prepared her for. She was now fighting a battle on two fronts, providing crucial sniper support for 163 trapped Rangers while simultaneously defending herself against Taliban fighters who were climbing the ridge to eliminate her. Every decision she made would affect not only her own survival, but the lives of every Ranger pinned down in the valley below. The approaching Taliban fighters moved with tactical discipline, using the rocky terrain to provide cover as they advanced up the ridge. Maria could see at least 12 fighters making their way toward her position, armed with AK-47s and RPGs, moving in a coordinated pattern that suggested they had experience with assault operations against fortified positions. Maria's first engagement with the approaching fighters came when the lead element moved into an exposed area approximately 300 meters from her position. Through her scope, she could see the point man scanning the terrain ahead while his teammates provided overwatch. Maria's shot was precise and immediate, eliminating the threat and causing the remaining fighters to seek cover while they reassessed their approach. But even as she engaged the fighters approaching her position, Maria could see through her peripheral vision that the Taliban forces in the valley were increasing their pressure on the trapped Rangers. Without constant sniper support, Rahman's fighters were becoming more aggressive, moving closer to the Rangers' defensive positions and preparing for coordinated assaults. Captain Morrison's radio transmissions revealed the increasing desperation of the Ranger situation. Ammunition was becoming critically low, several men had been wounded, and the defensive perimeter was shrinking under constant pressure. Morrison understood that Maria was facing her own tactical challenges, but he also knew that his men's survival depended on her continued support. Maria made rapid calculations about ammunition management and target priority. She had a limited number of rounds remaining, and she needed to use them in a way that would have maximum impact on both fronts of her battle. Her decision was to focus on eliminating high-value targets that would disrupt enemy operations rather than engaging every visible threat. In the valley below, Maria identified a Taliban machine gun team that was moving into position to provide suppressive fire for an assault on the Rangers' eastern flank. The two-man team was carrying a PCAM machine gun and several ammunition boxes, clearly intending to establish a position that would allow them to pin down the Rangers while other fighters advanced. Maria's shot eliminated the gunner just as he was setting up his weapon, causing his partner to abandon the machine gun and flee to a covered position. This single shot prevented what could have been a devastating attack on the Rangers' most vulnerable flank, buying them precious time to reorganize their defensive positions. But Maria's engagement in the valley had revealed her exact position to the Taliban fighters climbing the ridge. She could hear voices calling out in Pashto, coordinating their movements as they adjusted their approach to target her confirmed location. The hunters were closing in, and Maria realized she had only minutes before they would be close enough to assault her position directly. The Taliban fighters on the ridge began using suppressive fire to cover their advance, forcing Maria to keep her head down while they moved closer to her position. AK-47 rounds began impacting the rocks around her, sending fragments flying and creating a constant threat that limited her ability to observe and engage targets in the valley below. Rahman, monitoring the battle from his command position, recognized that eliminating the sniper had become crucial to the success of his operation. He began coordinating a simultaneous assault. His fighters on the ridge would eliminate the sniper, while his forces in the valley launched a final coordinated attack on the trapped Rangers. The timing would be critical, but if successful, it would eliminate the only factor that had prevented his complete victory. Maria understood the tactical reality she faced. If she focused entirely on defending herself against the approaching fighters, the Rangers below would be overrun. If she continued providing support for the Rangers, she would eventually be overwhelmed by the fighters climbing toward her position. Either choice seemed to lead to catastrophic failure. But Maria had not survived 6 months of combat operations by accepting impossible situations. She began moving between multiple positions on the ridge, using the terrain to her advantage while maintaining her ability to engage targets in both directions. This constant movement made it harder for the approaching fighters to pin down her exact location while allowing her to continue providing sporadic support for the trapped Rangers. Her next shot targeted a Taliban fighter in the valley who was carrying what appeared to be additional ammunition for his squad. Maria had observed him moving between different fighting positions, resupplying other fighters with magazines and grenades. Eliminating him would disrupt the Taliban's ammunition distribution and potentially cause several fighting positions to become less effective as their ammunition ran low. The shot was successful, but it also drew more intense return fire from both the valley and the ridge. Maria was forced to change positions immediately, crawling through the rocky terrain while bullets impacted all around her previous location. The Taliban fighters were learning to coordinate their fire, attempting to pin her down long enough for their assault teams to close the distance. Captain Morrison, observing the increased enemy pressure on Maria's position, made a tactical decision that demonstrated the bonds of brotherhood that define military units. Despite his own desperate situation, Morrison ordered his men to shift some of their fire toward the ridge, attempting to provide what support they could for the sniper who had been keeping them alive. The Rangers' supporting fire was limited by their ammunition situation and the awkward angle of engagement, but it forced the Taliban fighters on the ridge to slow their advance and seek better cover. Every minute of delay potentially gave Maria more time to thin out their numbers before they could reach her position. Maria used the temporary respite to make a more detailed assessment of her tactical situation. She counted at least 10 Taliban fighters still approaching her position, though several had been slowed by the Rangers' supporting fire. In the valley, she could see Rahman's forces massing for what appeared to be a final coordinated assault on multiple fronts. Her ammunition count revealed a harsh reality. She had fewer than 20 rounds remaining. Each shot would need to accomplish multiple objectives, disrupting enemy operations while conserving ammunition for the final phase of the battle. Maria began identifying targets that would have the greatest impact on enemy coordination and effectiveness. Through her scope, Maria observed a Taliban fighter who appeared to be directing the assault preparations in the valley. He was positioned behind a large boulder, using hand signals to coordinate the movement of multiple fighting teams. His elimination would likely cause confusion and delay in the Taliban's final assault. Maria's shot was perfect, eliminating the tactical coordinator and causing immediate disruption among the fighters he had been directing. She could see confusion spreading through the Taliban ranks as different groups lost coordination and began operating independently rather than as part of a coordinated assault. But the Taliban fighters on the ridge were now close enough that Maria could hear their individual voices as they communicated their movements. They were approximately 150 meters from her position and closing rapidly, using covering fire and movement techniques that demonstrated their combat experience. Maria realized that the final phase of the battle was beginning. Within minutes, she would be engaged in close-quarters combat while simultaneously trying to provide long-range support for the trapped Rangers. The outcome would depend on her ability to fight effectively on both fronts while managing her limited ammunition and maintaining the tactical awareness necessary to keep her fellow soldiers alive. Through her scope, she could see that Rahman's forces in the valley were beginning their final assault despite the loss of their coordinator. Taliban fighters were advancing from multiple directions, moving through smoke and using covering fire to close the distance to the Rangers' defensive positions. The moment that Maria had been preparing for throughout the entire battle was finally arriving. The Taliban fighters climbing the ridge began their final assault just as their comrades in the valley launched their coordinated attack. Maria found herself at the center of a battle that would determine the fate of 163 American soldiers and test every aspect of her training, courage, and determination. The next few minutes would determine whether her heroic efforts had been sufficient to save her fellow Rangers or whether they would all become casualties of Rahman's carefully planned ambush. The sound of boots on rock and urgent whispers in Pashto told Maria that the Taliban fighters were now within 100 meters of her position. She could no longer afford to maintain her primary sniper position, as it would leave her completely exposed to the approaching assault team. But abandoning her overwatch position would also mean that the Rangers below would lose their most effective support just as they faced their final and most dangerous challenge. Maria made a decision that would define the rest of the battle. Rather than retreating or focusing solely on defending herself, she would use the terrain of the ridge to fight a mobile defense, moving between positions to engage threats from both directions while denying the Taliban fighters a fixed target to assault. Her first movement took her to a position approximately 50 meters from her original location, behind a cluster of boulders that provided cover from multiple directions. From this position, she could still observe most of the valley while maintaining defensive positions against the approaching fighters. The movement was executed during a lull in the enemy's suppressive fire, allowing her to relocate without being observed. From her new position, Maria could see that the Taliban assault in the valley had reached its most critical phase. Rangers' positions were being engaged from multiple directions simultaneously, with Taliban fighters advancing under covering fire from machine guns and RPGs. Captain Morrison's radio transmissions revealed that several defensive positions had been overrun, and the Rangers were falling back to a smaller perimeter around a rocky outcrop that provided limited cover. Maria identified her next priority target, a Taliban machine gunner who had established a position that was preventing the Rangers from effectively defending their eastern flank. The gunner was partially concealed behind a large rock, but Maria could see enough of his silhouette to attempt a shot. The range was challenging due to her new position, but the shot was crucial for the Ranger's survival. Her bullet found its target, silencing the machine gun and providing the Rangers with an opportunity to re-establish their defensive line. But the muzzle flash from her rifle also revealed her new position to the Taliban fighters on the ridge, who immediately began directing concentrated fire toward her location. Maria was forced to move again as AK-47 rounds began impacting the rocks around her. She low-crawled approximately 30 meters to another defensive position, using the natural terrain features to mask her movement. The constant repositioning was exhausting, but it was keeping her alive while allowing her to maintain some level of support for the trapped Rangers. The Taliban fighters on the ridge had split into two groups, attempting to flank her position from different directions. Maria could hear them coordinating their movements, calling out positions, and planning their final assault. She realized that within minutes, She would be engaged in close-quarters combat with multiple enemies while trying to maintain observation of the valley battle. Through her scope, Maria observed Ramon himself moving among his fighters in the valley, apparently preparing for a final coordinated push to overrun the Rangers' remaining positions. Ramon's presence on the battlefield suggested that he was confident of victory and wanted to personally oversee the elimination of the trapped American soldiers. Maria faced a critical decision. Ramon was within range and presented a clear target, but engaging him would require her to expose herself to the Taliban fighters who were now less than 50 meters from her position. However, eliminating the Taliban commander could disrupt the entire enemy operation and provide the Rangers with their best chance of survival. She steadied her rifle and took careful aim at Ramon, who was standing behind cover, but presenting enough of a target for a skilled marksman. Maria's breathing slowed as she prepared for what could be the most important shot of the entire battle. Ramon's elimination might end the coordinated Taliban attack and force his fighters to withdraw or lose coordination. The shot rang out across the valley just as the first Taliban fighter appeared at the edge of Maria's defensive position. Ramon fell immediately, struck center mass by Maria's precisely aimed bullet. The impact on Taliban morale was immediate and visible. Fighters began looking around in confusion, and the coordinated nature of their assault began to fragment as different groups lost direction. But Maria's success came at a cost. The Taliban fighter who had reached her position opened fire with his AK-47, forcing Maria to abandon her sniper rifle and draw her sidearm. The range was less than 20 meters, and the engagement became a desperate fight for survival between two highly trained combatants. Maria's training in close-quarters combat proved decisive. Her first shot with her pistol eliminated the immediate threat, but she could hear other fighters approaching from different directions. She retrieved her rifle and moved to yet another position, knowing that she was now fighting for her life while the Rangers below faced their final trial. The elimination of Ramon had indeed disrupted the Taliban assault, but it had not ended it. Taliban fighters continued their attacks on the Rangers' positions, though with less coordination and effectiveness. Some groups began withdrawing from the battlefield, apparently deciding that the cost of the operation had become too high without their commander's leadership. Captain Morrison recognized the change in enemy behavior and began coordinating a more aggressive defense. With reduced pressure from coordinated attacks, the Rangers were able to establish more effective fields of fire and begin pushing back against the remaining Taliban fighters. Morrison's radio calls revealed renewed hope, though the situation remained critical. Maria engaged two more Taliban fighters who attempted to assault her position from different directions. Her ammunition was now critically low. Fewer than 10 rounds remained for her rifle, and her pistol had limited ammunition as well. Each shot had to count, and each engagement had to be decisive. The battle on the ridge became a deadly game of cat and mouse, with Maria using her superior knowledge of the terrain and her training to outmaneuver fighters who still outnumbered her significantly. She moved constantly, never remaining in the same position for more than a few minutes, making it impossible for the remaining Taliban fighters to coordinate an effective assault. Through brief glimpses during her movements, Maria could see that the situation in the valley was stabilizing. The Rangers had managed to re-establish a defensive perimeter, and Taliban attacks were becoming more sporadic and less coordinated. The elimination of Ramon and several key leaders had clearly disrupted the enemy's command structure. But Maria's personal situation remained desperate. She was down to her last few rounds of ammunition, physically exhausted from hours of combat, and still facing multiple enemy fighters who were determined to eliminate her. The Taliban fighters on the ridge had also realized that the battle in the valley was not proceeding as planned, making the elimination of the sniper even more crucial to salvaging something from their failed operation. Maria's next engagement came when 3 Taliban fighters attempted a coordinated assault on her position from different angles. She eliminated one with her rifle, wounded another with her pistol, and was forced to use her knife to eliminate the third fighter who had closed to within arm's reach. The close-quarters combat was vicious and exhausting, but Maria's superior training and determination proved decisive. As the sun reached its zenith, Maria realized that she had been fighting continuously for over 3 hours. Her ammunition was almost exhausted, her water was gone, and she was operating on adrenaline and pure determination. But Through her scope, she could see that the Rangers in the valley were not only surviving, but beginning to gain the upper hand against the remaining Taliban fighters. The sound of helicopter rotors in the distance announced the arrival of the reinforcements that had been promised hours earlier. Apache attack helicopters appeared over the ridge, followed by transport helicopters carrying fresh troops and supplies. The cavalry had finally arrived, but Maria Rodriguez had already accomplished what many would have considered impossible. The Taliban fighters remaining on the ridge began withdrawing as soon as the helicopters appeared, recognizing that their tactical situation had become hopeless. Maria emerged from her defensive position, exhausted but victorious, as the first rescue helicopters began landing in the valley to evacuate the wounded Rangers and resupply Morrison's positions. Through her scope, Maria could see Captain Morrison coordinating the evacuation of his wounded men while maintaining security around the landing zones. The Rangers had survived an impossible situation, and Maria realized that her individual efforts had been crucial to keeping them alive long enough for help to arrive. But the full impact of her actions would not become apparent until after the battle, when military analysts began studying what had become one of the most remarkable individual combat performances in modern military history. The Apache helicopters circled the battlefield like mechanical vultures, their weapons systems tracking the retreating Taliban fighters who were abandoning their positions throughout the valley. The arrival of reinforcements had fundamentally changed the tactical situation, transforming what had been a desperate defensive action into a routing of enemy forces. Maria Rodriguez sat behind her boulder, completely exhausted, watching as medevac helicopters landed in the valley to evacuate the wounded Rangers. Her rifle lay across her lap, empty of ammunition, a weapon that had fired more than 60 precision shots during the battle. Each shot had been carefully aimed, each target specifically chosen to maximize the survival chances of her fellow soldiers. Captain Morrison's voice crackled over the radio as he coordinated the evacuation operations and provided situation reports to the incoming reinforcement commanders. His transmissions revealed the scope of what the Rangers had endured. They had been engaged continuously for over 3 hours, expended nearly all of their ammunition, and sustained multiple casualties. But they had survived an ambush that should have resulted in complete annihilation. The rescue operation proceeded with military efficiency, but Maria remained on the ridge, providing overwatch for the evacuation even though her ammunition was exhausted. Her training and sense of responsibility would not allow her to abandon her position until every Ranger had been safely evacuated from the kill zone where they had been trapped. Through her scope, Maria observed the aftermath of the battle in the valley below. The terrain was littered with evidence of the intense firefight, expended ammunition casings, destroyed equipment, and the bodies of Taliban fighters who had been eliminated during the assault. The rocky ground showed scars from RPG impacts and machine gun fire, testament to the intensity of the engagement. Colonel Sarah Mitchell, the commanding officer of the rescue force, landed with the second wave of helicopters and immediately began coordinating the investigation of the battlefield. Mitchell was a veteran of multiple combat deployments, but even her experience, I could see that something extraordinary had occurred in this remote Afghan valley. The body count told a remarkable story. Preliminary reports indicated that over 40 Taliban fighters had been killed during the engagement, with many more wounded. The majority of these casualties had been inflicted by precise rifle fire from long range, suggesting the work of a highly skilled marksman rather than the typical spray-and-pray tactics common in Afghan firefights. Captain Morrison briefed Colonel Mitchell on the tactical situation, emphasizing the crucial role that Maria Rodriguez had played in the survival of his unit. Morrison's account described not just accurate shooting, but tactical brilliance, target selection that disrupted enemy coordination, timing that broke up assault preparations, and individual courage that had been maintained throughout hours of continuous combat. Maria, finally, descended from her ridge position as the last of the wounded Rangers were loaded onto medevac helicopters. Her uniform was torn and dirty, her equipment was battered from hours of crawling over rocky terrain, and her face showed the exhaustion of someone who had fought a desperate battle against overwhelming odds. But her eyes still held the sharp focus of a professional warrior who had accomplished her mission. Colonel Mitchell's first meeting with Maria Rodriguez was brief but significant. Mitchell had read Maria's service record during the helicopter flight to the battlefield, but seeing her in person provided a different perspective. Maria was a compact woman, barely 5 feet 6 inches tall, who looked more like a college student than a warrior who had just single-handedly disrupted an entire Taliban operation. The initial debriefing revealed the scope of Maria's individual performance. She had fired 63 shots during the engagement, achieving a hit rate of over 90%. More importantly, her target selection had been strategically brilliant. She had eliminated key leaders, disrupted weapons teams, and broken up coordinated attacks at crucial moments throughout the battle. But the numbers only told part of the story. Maria's tactical decision-making under extreme pressure had been exceptional. When faced with the choice between defending herself and supporting the trapped Rangers, she had found a way to do both. Her mobile defense on the ridge had prevented the Taliban from overrunning her position while maintaining her ability to provide crucial support for Morrison's men. The battlefield forensics revealed additional details about Maria's performance. Investigators found evidence that she had engaged targets at ranges from 800 meters down to less than 20 meters, transitioning seamlessly from precision long-range shooting to close-quarters combat as the tactical situation demanded. This versatility was rare even among special operations personnel. Captain Morrison's formal report to Colonel Mitchell emphasized that Maria's actions had saved the lives of every Ranger in his unit. Without her intervention, the Taliban ambush would have succeeded completely, resulting in the annihilation of 163 American soldiers. Morrison's assessment was that Maria Rodriguez had prevented what would have been one of the worst single-day losses of American personnel in the Afghanistan conflict. The Taliban's perspective on the battle emerged through intelligence reports gathered in the following weeks. Captured fighters described their confusion and demoralization as their carefully planned ambush was disrupted by what they believed was a large sniper team. The psychological impact of precise, long-range fire from an unseen enemy had been devastating to Taliban morale and coordination. Abdul Rahman's death had been particularly significant to the Taliban's assessment of the battle. Rahman had been a respected commander whose tactical skills and experience had made him valuable to Taliban operations throughout the region. His elimination, along with several other key leaders, had decapitated the command structure that had coordinated the ambush. Intelligence analysis revealed that the Taliban had been planning the ambush for months, gathering intelligence on American patrol patterns and carefully positioning weapons and fighters for what they expected to be a decisive victory. The operation had involved over 200 fighters and represented a significant investment of Taliban resources and planning. Maria's individual performance had effectively neutralized this massive enemy investment. Her shooting had eliminated key personnel, disrupted coordination, and created the tactical confusion that allowed outnumbered Rangers to survive until reinforcements arrived. Military analysts would later describe her actions as a textbook example of how individual skill and determination could overcome overwhelming numerical disadvantage. The awards and recognition that followed the battle reflected the extraordinary nature of Maria's actions. She received the Silver Star for gallantry in action, but many of her fellow Rangers felt that even this high honor was insufficient recognition for what she had accomplished. Maria had literally saved 163 lives through individual courage and skill, but perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from the Rangers themselves. In the weeks following the battle, Maria received letters and messages from the wives and children of the Rangers whose lives she had saved. These personal expressions of gratitude had a profound impact on Maria, helping her understand the full significance of her actions during those desperate hours on the Afghan ridge. The media attention that followed was extensive, but carefully managed to protect operational security. Maria's story became a powerful example of individual heroism, but also highlighted the broader contributions of women in combat roles. Her actions demonstrated that courage and skill were not limited by gender, challenging traditional assumptions about women in warfare. Years later, Maria Rodriguez would retire from the Army as a master sergeant, having served multiple additional deployments and trained countless other snipers in the skills that had proven so crucial that day in Afghanistan. But she would always be remembered as the woman who saved 163 Rangers through individual courage, skill, and unwavering determination. The battle in the Khyber province became a case study taught in military schools around the world, an example of how individual excellence could overcome seemingly impossible odds. But for Maria Rodriguez and the Rangers she saved, it remained something much more personal. a testament to the bonds of brotherhood and the lengths that soldiers will go to protect each other. Captain Morrison, who survived the battle without serious injury, would later say that Maria Rodriguez represented everything that was best about the American military: skill, courage, and an absolute commitment to never leaving a fellow soldier behind. In a war that often seemed defined by ambiguous objectives and unclear victories, Maria's actions provided a clear example of heroism that inspired an entire generation of soldiers. The ridge in Afghanistan where Maria Rodriguez made her stand remains marked on military maps, a geographic reminder of a day when one person's courage and skill changed the course of history for 163 American soldiers and their families. Her story continues to inspire new generations of warriors who understand that sometimes being a hero means standing alone against impossible odds and refusing to give up when everything depends on your individual strength and determination.